The fluorescent lights hum above Cedar Creek Medical like cicadas trapped in glass. Ashley Cooper keeps her eyes down as she moves through the corridor, her scrubs hanging 2 sizes too large on her frame, deliberate, calculated. Oversized fabric conceals muscle memory. It conceals the scars that map her forearms like topographic lines when she reaches for supply cabinets. Nobody sees. Nobody should. Her nursing station sits in the pediatric wing's east corridor, where the walls are painted a soft yellow and laminated animals float across them like they're swimming through hope. A cracked mug reads "World's Okayest Nurse, gift from someone who didn't know her," which was precisely the point. Beside it, a dying succulent struggles in its ceramic pot, leaves curled like fists. She waters it anyway. Discipline is discipline, whether the thing you're keeping alive survives or not. The jacket draped over her chair is 14 years old. The fabric has faded from forest green to something closer to ash. Inside the lining, hidden from casual inspection, a unit patch is sewn with methodical stitches, insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Every morning before shift, her fingers find it without thinking. She doesn't look. She just traces the embroidered eagle with her thumb, a ritual that takes 3 seconds. Today it takes longer. Dr. Richard Mercer sweeps into the unit at 0745 with his entourage trailing like remoras behind a shark. 2 resident physicians, a medical student, a scribe clicking away on a tablet. He moves with the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. 62 years old. Ivy League education. Chief of pediatric surgery for 7 years running. His tie costs more than Ashley's monthly rent. She doesn't look up. Mercer pauses at the nursing station, not to speak to her, but to check the schedule posted on the wall. His shadow falls across her desk. The coffee mug catches his eye for a moment. She feels his gaze, doesn't meet it, keeps her attention on the medication reconciliation sheet in front of her. The pen in her hand stays steady. Her jaw doesn't clench. This is the work, being present without being seen. Morning rounds in 5 minutes, he says to no one in particular, and his entourage follows him down the corridor like ducklings after their mother. Ashley breathes once. Twice. Her hands are very still. The intake board displays the day's appointments in clean rows. Patient names, ages, presenting conditions, assigned physicians. She scans it while pretending to update the supply inventory, a habit she's perfected. Most of the entries blur past her attention: a 7-year-old with a broken ulna, a 9-year-old with acute appendicitis, a 6-year-old here for a routine pre-op physical. Then she sees it. Emma Davidson. Age 8. Optic nerve damage secondary to blast trauma. Captain Marcus Davidson listed as parent guardian. Scheduled for Dr. Mercer. 1,030 hours. Her hand stills on the clipboard. The pen doesn't move for 4 seconds. Captain Marcus Davidson. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. She knows his operational record the way most people know their children's birthdays, exact, permanent, carved into memory with the precision of a scar. She knows that he led a squad of 14 Marines through the Panj River Valley in Kuna Province in 2019. She knows that an IED concealed in a rock formation detonated when his unit passed, sending shrapnel through tissue and bone. She knows that he lost his vision saving his squad, that he covered a junior enlisted with his own body while fire rained down from 3 directions. She also knows, from the classified briefing marked eyes only that she reviewed in a Pentagon office on a Tuesday morning 6 months ago, that Captain Davidson might hold the key to something bigger. Something that involves experimental nerve regeneration protocols and Taliban field research that somehow, inexplicably, had produced results that Western medicine couldn't replicate. The briefing had been thin on details. The briefing had been thick with implication. And his daughter is blind. The coincidence tastes like copper. Ashley sets the clipboard down and pulls Emma's file from the system on her computer. The medical record is thick with specialist appointments: ophthalmology at Johns Hopkins, neurology at Duke, genetic testing at Children's Hospital Boston. 14 specialists. 14 dead ends. The damage to her optic nerves was too severe, the prognosis too grim. Complete vision loss by age 9, they said. No treatment options. No clinical trials available. Until now. Until Dr. Richard Mercer scheduled her for an evaluation he hadn't yet disclosed the actual purpose of. She closes the file and stands, moving toward the supply room with the same mechanical precision she's perfected over the past 6 months. The supply room is empty at 0815. Fluorescent lights flicker overhead, one of them buzzes louder than the others, an irritating metronome. She reaches for the foretubing on the top shelf, her sleeve riding up. The scars are visible if anyone looks. If anyone really looks. They run like rivers up the inside of her left forearm, 7 distinct lines, each one a story. One from a fragment that went through the inside of her wrist during a medevac extraction. One from a surgical incision when she rebuilt her own median nerve in a field hospital bathroom with borrowed instruments. One from infection that nearly cost her the arm entirely. The skin is pale where the scars live, paler than the rest of her. Newly grafted tissue that still hasn't quite matched. When her sleeve falls back down, she is invisible again. The briefing had said the daughter was already showing signs of advanced optic nerve degeneration, faster than the typical progression. The briefing had said that Captain Davidson was exhibiting unusual recovery patterns in his own vision rehabilitation, patterns that didn't match the severity of his initial injury. The briefing had implied, without stating, that someone had been treating him. Someone with access to something. The briefing had also said, monitor his civilian medical interactions closely. Embed assets in any facility where his daughter receives care. The Navy doesn't deploy a captain to a pediatric nursing station in Norfolk because they have nothing else to do. Ashley pulls the foretubing, 3 boxes of it, and carries them back to her station. By 0930, she has reorganized the entire medication stock, verified all open 4 lines, and updated the pediatric dosing calculations for the 6 children currently admitted to the unit. Her work is meticulous. Perfect. Invisible. Dr. Mercer rounds at 1015 with his entourage still in formation. He moves from room to room with the efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times, each stop precise and brief. He asks questions without waiting for complete answers. He makes decisions before the data has finished being presented. He is good at what he does, in the way that dangerous people often are. But that wasn't the worst part. At 10:20, Captain Marcus Davidson arrives at the pediatric unit. He moves with a cane, not because he needs it to walk, but because he needs it to move through space in a way that won't alarm the people around him. His eyes, when they're visible, are focused on nothing. He wears the particular stillness of a blind man who has learned to occupy space with precision anyway. And holding his hand is Emma. The girl is small for 8 years old, dark-haired, with her father's broad shoulders and her mother's mouth. She moves with the careful deliberation of a child navigating a world she can't see, her other hand extended slightly as if testing the air for obstacles. She's wearing a lavender dress with buttons that probably took her mother 20 minutes to close this morning. Ashley's chest tightens in a way that has nothing to do with the mission. Mercer meets them at the entrance to the evaluation room, his smile warm and professional in the way that smiles are when they're performed rather than felt. Captain Davidson. Emma. Good to see you. We have some exciting developments to discuss. The girl looks up in the direction of his voice, her eyes moving slightly as if trying to track him, though they don't quite focus. That slight movement costs her something. Ashley can see the micro-expression that flickers across her face. Effort. Pain. The ghost of hope that maybe, this time, something will be different. Captain Davidson nods once. Dr. Mercer. Thanks for taking us on. Of course. Mercer gestures toward the room. Come on in. This shouldn't take long. But it will, Ashley thinks. It will take everything. She watches them disappear into the evaluation room, the door closing with a soft click. Through the window in the door, she can see Emma sitting on the examination table, her feet swinging slightly because they don't quite reach the floor. Mercer is already talking, his hands animated as he explains something. Captain Davidson's face remains perfectly still. Ashley returns to her station and pulls up the most recent laboratory values in the computer system. She is looking for something, she isn't sure what yet. A drug interaction that doesn't make sense. A medication order that seems high for pediatric dosing. Something that doesn't fit. But Mercer is good at what he does. If he's hiding something, it won't be in the obvious places. She opens Emma's original intake file from 6 months ago, the very first appointment when Captain Davidson brought her to Cedar Creek Medical seeking a second opinion. The notes are brief, clinical. Presenting complaint, progressive vision loss, refractory to specialist intervention. Physical exam, PERL, normal eye structure, intact pupillary reflex. Assessment and plan, refer to ophthalmology, rule out systemic causes. Boilerplate. Sterile. The kind of documentation written by someone who has already decided that nothing can be done. But there's a handwritten note in the margin of the physical exam. It's in Mercer's handwriting, she recognizes it from a dozen other files, unusual pattern. Worth investigating further. Consider for research study. Research study. The file doesn't mention any research study. Ashley closes the computer screen and folds her hands on the desk in front of her. The unit has fallen quiet in that particular way that hospitals fall quiet before something significant happens. The oxygen concentrators hum in the distance. A phone rings 3 rooms down. A child coughs. At 11:05, Captain Davidson and Emma emerge from the evaluation room. The girl's hand is in her father's, and she's walking slightly closer to him than before, as if the world has contracted a little bit more. But her father's face has changed. Something in the set of his jaw. Something in the way he's breathing. Ashley meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to confirm that he sees her, or at least sees the space where she stands. His pupils dilate slightly. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of something. A presence that doesn't belong in the pediatric intake area of a civilian hospital in Norfolk, Virginia. Then he looks away, protecting her the same way soldiers protect each other in crowded spaces. You don't acknowledge the sniper. You don't confirm the position. You don't compromise the asset. They exit through the corridor that leads to the main lobby. Ashley doesn't move. Her hands remain folded. Her breathing remains steady. But behind her sternum, something shifts. The mission has no longer begun. It has finally, irrevocably, started. Morning light flooded Cedar Creek Medical's corridors in that harsh way that made everything look like a crime scene. Ashley stood at her nursing station reviewing Emma Davidson's medication interactions when she heard them, the approaching footsteps of an entire surgical team moving in formation, like a school of predatory fish drawn by the scent of blood in water. Dr. Mercer led them, his white coat pristine, his posture a monument to the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. He stopped directly in front of her station, close enough that she could smell the antiseptic soap he'd scrubbed with, and gestured toward the medication flagging she'd logged the night before. The chart glowed on her monitor like an accusation. This, he announced to the assembled residents and fellows, his voice carrying the weight of theatrical certainty, is what happens when we lower our standards. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. Nurses who think checking a physician's orders makes them qualified to practice medicine. We have a term for this, Florence Nightingale syndrome. She wants to be the hero so badly she second-guesses people with actual medical degrees. The residents took notes. One of them, a third-year named Chen, glanced at Ashley with something that looked like sympathy before quickly looking away. The heat crawled up Ashley's neck in a slow, deliberate climb, but she kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen. Her jaw tightened, not a tremble, not a break in composure, just a small muscle group doing what her mind demanded. She did not look at Dr. Mercer. Did not acknowledge him. Did not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Instead, she expanded a lab value on her screen and made a note in even handwriting that betrayed nothing of what was happening inside her chest. The surgical team moved past like a funeral procession, Dr. Mercer's voice still echoing behind them about standards and scope of practice and the importance of respecting the hierarchy that kept hospitals functioning. Ashley recognized the strategy. This was stage 2 of his escalation, no longer just condescension in private moments, but public humiliation designed to poison the well before she could act again. He was making her radioactive, untouchable, unreliable. A nurse who thought she was smarter than the doctors. The kind of person that junior staff should avoid. That afternoon at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, she learned he'd succeeded. The 2 residents approached from around the corner, Chen and Rodriguez, both of whom she'd trained personally during their first month at Cedar Creek. She'd walked them through their first central line placements, stood beside them during their initial codes, corrected their technique with the kind of gentle precision that builds confidence. Rodriguez had been terrified of approaching the femoral vein. Ashley had steadied his hand and talked him through it, and now he was competent, careful, the kind of doctor patients hoped they'd get. Both of them had thanked her then. Both of them had called her Dr. Cooper as a joke, a way of saying they understood she knew more than her title suggested. They saw her coming and exchanged a glance, a millisecond of calculation that felt like a blade. Then Rodriguez turned his shoulder to her and Chen did the same, and they continued their conversation as if she'd become invisible, a ghost passing through the break room. One of them whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Mercer says she's been flagging medications out of spite, trying to make him look bad because she's bitter about her station in life." Ashley stopped in front of the vending machine with exact change in her palm. She did not flinch. She did not turn around. She fed the machine 3/4 and pressed the button for black coffee, listening to the mechanical descent of the cup, the hiss of the dispenser, the grinding sound of fluid filling something that would soon be empty again. When she turned around, the residents were already gone, their conversation a disappearing echo down the corridor. She took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like copper and restraint. She needed Jell-O. She needed anything that wouldn't remind her of blood pressure medications and drug interactions and children who couldn't see. That evening, she intercepted Dr. Mercer in the hallway outside pediatrics. He was moving with the kind of velocity that suggested he was late, which meant he would be irritable, which meant this was probably a mistake, but Emma Davidson's dosage calculation had been needling her since that morning. The numbers didn't align. The steroid protocol he proposed interacted with the anticonvulsant she was already taking, and the combination at those doses could cause hepatic injury, could cause exactly the kind of systemic damage that would compound her existing condition. Ashley had checked it twice. 3 times. 4. The math was unmistakable. "Dr. Mercer, I wanted to clarify the dosage on the Davidson protocol." He stopped. He turned. His eyes were the color of winter water, and they did not warm when they looked at her. "Yes?" "The steroid interaction with her current medication. The numbers don't resolve properly." He leaned close. His coffee breath was hot against her face, and his voice dropped into a register that only she could hear. "Security can escort you out in handcuffs, or you can walk out with whatever dignity you have left. Your choice, Nurse Cooper. But you will not question me again. Not in front of staff. Not anywhere. Is that understood?" She took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape and wiped it without breaking her gaze from his. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, all of the training, all of the operations, all of the discipline compressed into one moment of controlled response. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a heartbeat, and it came from a place in her chest that she hadn't accessed in 18 months. "Emma's father replaced me in the Hindu Kush and lost his vision saving his squad. Captain Marcus Davidson took over my position when I was pulled for reassignment, and he walked into the Korengal Valley blind because that was the mission. I won't let his daughter go blind because you're too arrogant to double-check your math." The silence stretched like taffy. Dr. Mercer's face purpled, his jaw working soundlessly for 3 seconds, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes, and not quite fear, but recognition. The realization that she knew something about Captain Davidson. That her connection to his case ran deeper than a simple nursing assignment. His mouth opened and closed twice before he turned and walked away, but not before she saw the calculation happen in real time. She'd made an enemy who played the long game. She'd also made a mistake. But that wasn't the worst part. When Ashley arrived for her shift the next morning, her schedule had changed. Not adjusted. Not modified. Obliterated. The assignment board that had shown her name on the pediatric ward rotation now displayed it on the geriatric floor, the opposite end of Cedar Creek Medical, a 40-minute walk through corridors that felt like they were designed to isolate and distance. She approached the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who usually smiled when she saw her. Patricia wouldn't meet her eyes. "Your skills will be better utilized on the geriatric ward," Patricia said, and the words were so clearly scripted that Ashley almost asked her if she'd needed to rehearse them. Dr. Mercer felt it was a better fit for your experience level. Strategic isolation. Complete and calculated. Dr. Mercer wasn't firing her, that would be too obvious, too easy to fight. He was moving her, burying her, removing her from Emma Davidson's care just as she'd begun to understand what was happening. The child had been scheduled for a procedure. The dosages were wrong. The interactions were dangerous. And now Ashley would be 600 feet away, changing bedpans in the geriatric wing while a brilliant little girl underwent a treatment protocol that could cause permanent damage. She spent 2 days in professional exile, watching the second hand on the wall clock at the geriatric station tick away the hours until Emma's procedure. She tried calling the department head. Voicemail. She tried paging the hospital administrator. No callback. The system was working exactly as designed. Dr. Mercer had moved too fast, too decisively, and now she was neutralized. Removed. A complaining nurse on the wrong side of the hospital with no credibility and no access. At 2,200 hours that night, Ashley stood in the parking lot staring at her phone while rain began to hammer the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. She could walk away. She could catch a ride-share, go home, let the system work itself out. Captain Marcus Davidson had lost his vision in service. His daughter might lose hers in a hospital bed. The thought moved through her like a tactical assessment. The facts were clear. The variables were laid out. The choice was binary. She returned to Cedar Creek Medical through the service entrance at 2,300 hours, her CAC card already knowing it wouldn't work on the pediatric ward locks anymore. She waited near the supply closet in the stairwell for someone to open the door, a respiratory tech, a housekeeper, anyone moving between floors. When a nurse pushed through carrying fresh linens, Ashley caught the edge of the door and slipped into the pediatrics corridor, her footsteps soundless on the tile, her movements practiced in a way that looked completely natural to anyone who didn't understand what they were seeing. Emma Davidson's room was dark. The girl was already prepped for surgery, her small body in a hospital gown, her sightless eyes fixed on a ceiling she could not see. The medication chart glowed on the bedside monitor, and Ashley's hands moved on their own, not trembling, not hesitant, just precise and certain. The dosages were exactly what she'd calculated. Wrong. Dangerous. A gift wrapped in medical authority with a bow made of arrogance. She did not alter the chart. That would be too obvious. Instead, she made a phone call to the on-call pharmacist, a woman she'd trained 3 years ago, who owed her nothing but still answered her private number at 2,301 hours because Ashley's voice in the darkness carried a kind of authority that transcended rank. "I need you to verify a dosage interaction on a pediatric steroid protocol. Right now. Before Emma Davidson's 0300 procedure." The pharmacist was quiet for a moment. Then, "Hold on. I'm pulling it up." The silence lasted 47 seconds. "Ashley, where did you get this calculation? Is it wrong?" Another pause. The rain continued hammering outside. Somewhere in Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Mercer was sleeping, confident that he'd neutralized the threat. He had no idea what was walking through his hospital. He had no idea who he was standing next to. "It's dangerously wrong," the pharmacist said. "If we'd administered this protocol, it would have caused acute liver failure within 48 hours. In an 8-year-old with existing optic nerve compromise. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I'll need this documented before surgery, Ashley said. Official documentation from pharmacy. Flagged for physician review. It's already being logged. I'm calling the attending. The line went dead. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, Ashley stood in the darkness of a blind child's hospital room and made a decision that would cost her everything, save everything, and change everything in ways she couldn't yet calculate. The mission was no longer covert. It had just become a rescue. The 0600 shift assignment posted on the employee portal told Ashley everything she needed to know. Geriatric ward. West Tower. Effective immediately. No notice, no conversation, no explanation beyond the clinical language of administrative reassignment. The pediatric ward, where Emma Davidson lay in pre-op observation, was now restricted territory. Dr. Mercer had made his move, and he'd made it surgical. Ashley stood at the locker in the break room, reading the email for the third time as if different words might materialize on the screen. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical complaint overhead, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Around her, day shift nurses gathered their badges and stethoscopes, their movements a choreography of routine that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different world. Nobody looked at her. Word had already spread through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors like an infection, the nurse who'd questioned the doctor, who'd stepped out of her lane, who'd been put back in it. That's some timing, a voice said behind her. It was Janet, charge nurse for pediatrics, her voice carefully neutral in the way of people who didn't want to be overheard. She set a stack of folded scrubs on the bench beside Ashley's locker, the gesture offering both camouflage and conversation. Mercer submitted the transfer request at 2,100 last night. Said he needed staff realignment in light of, quote, staffing concerns, unquote. Ashley closed the locker door. The metal clang echoed across the small room. What kind of concerns? The kind he doesn't specify. Janet's eye stayed fixed on the scrubs in her hands, but her jaw had tightened. I fought it. Made calls to HR, got told that attending physicians have discretion over their team composition, especially for high-stakes cases. Janet's voice dropped lower. Emma's scheduled for intervention at 0300. Mercer's doing something to her optic nerve pathway. He wouldn't let me review the actual procedure until yesterday, and even then it was just a summary. I've never seen him move this fast on a pediatric case. The world had narrowed. 12 hours ago, Ashley had access to every note in Emma's medical record, every test result, every preliminary scan. She'd been watching the case the way a sniper watches a target, patient, meticulous, waiting for the moment when intervention became inevitable. Now she was locked out. Worse than locked out. She was exiled. Reassigned to a different floor where she couldn't even see the pediatric ward without violating her new restrictions. He's scared, Ashley said quietly. It wasn't a question. Janet looked at her for the first time. There was something in that look, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who'd worked in hospitals long enough to understand that doctors weren't infallible, but they were almost always frightened. You're not supposed to be involved in this case anymore. I know. I'm telling you officially. As your charge nurse. You are reassigned to geriatrics. You will not access Emma's records. You will not enter the pediatric ward. You will not observe any procedures. Janet paused, and her voice became almost inaudible. I'm also telling you that Captain Davidson has been sitting in the waiting area since 04:30 this morning. He lost his vision in Helmand Province 11 years ago. He lost his wife to cancer 6 months ago. His daughter is the last thing he has, and he's terrified. The man has survived Taliban ambushes and lost brothers in the mountains. But watching his 8-year-old daughter's surgery is something else entirely. Ashley dressed slowly in her scrubs, moving through the motions like a soldier conducting a pre-mission check. Regulation blues. Compression socks. Hair pulled back. Badge clipped to her collar. The uniform of a nurse. The disguise of a woman who wasn't supposed to be watching a child's spinal fluid pressure monitor, wasn't supposed to see what Mercer was really trying. The uniform hid the scar tissue, the calluses, the instincts trained into muscle memory through 1,000 hours in operating theaters that didn't have windows or legal oversight. She took the employee stairs to avoid the main corridors where she might run into Mercer or his residence. The stairwell smelled like antiseptic and old concrete, a scent that had become as familiar to Ashley as diesel fuel and gun oil. She climbed to the 4th floor, where the pediatric ward's observation rooms looked down on the surgical suites like watchtowers. The hallway was empty at this hour. Most staff would be getting equipment ready, verifying medications, doing the invisible work that preceded every procedure. The observation room adjacent to Emma's surgical suite was accessible from a smaller corridor that branched off from the main pediatric ward. Ashley had memorized the layout during her first week, a habit born from years of needing to know every exit, every vantage point, every escape route. The door was unlocked. Hospital security for observation rooms was theoretical at best, designed to prevent theft rather than unauthorized viewing. Nobody ever imagined that someone would want to violate such restrictions. Nobody wanted to watch someone else's child cut open and turned inside out. The glass overlooked the surgical suite, giving Ashley a clear view of the room below. The lights were already on, brilliant as a spotlight, and a surgical tech was laying out instruments in precise rows on a draped table. Each one reflected the light like a small white star: retractors, forceps, scalpels, the gleaming architecture of surgical precision. But it was the patient that caught Ashley's breath in her chest, held it there without sound or motion. Emma Davidson lay on the pediatric surgical table, a small figure draped in blue, her head elevated at an angle that suggested Mercer was planning an intracranial approach. 8 years old. Blind since age 4. Her father's daughter, though the girl had never seen his face. The medical records described her as cooperative and emotionally stable, which in hospital language meant she'd stopped asking questions about whether she would ever see again. That kind of acceptance in a child always made Ashley want to break something. At 02 for 5 hours, Dr. Mercer entered the suite. He moved with his usual confidence, the bearing of a man who'd never been questioned successfully, whose authority had never been challenged by outcomes. But as Ashley watched through the glass, she saw something that made her pause. His hands weren't quite steady as he reached for the surgical gown his assistant held out. His shoulders were tension-tight under the fabric. His eyes kept moving to the monitors, to Emma's face, then away again, the pattern of someone calculating odds and not liking what the math produced. The 2 residents assisting him were younger. First-year fellows, probably, which meant they were still fresh enough to be competent but inexperienced enough to defer completely to their attending. They moved in Mercer's orbit, instruments passing from hand to hand like a ritual practiced 1,000 times. One of them, the younger one with the thin mouth and careful eyes, kept glancing at Mercer's hands. He saw it. Mercer caught that glance and his jaw tightened. The fluorescent lights reflected off the overhead surgical lamps, turning the whole scene into something that existed in white light and shadow, dreamlike and hyperreal. Ashley's breathing had slowed without her ordering it to. Her hands rested flat on the observation room counter. Her pulse had steadied into the measured rhythm it achieved under fire. Mercer began the procedure at 0257. His voice over the surgical loudspeaker was authoritative, calling out steps and instructions with the clipped precision that nurses recognized as confidence or arrogance, often the same thing. But Ashley heard something else underneath it. Uncertainty. The kind that comes from knowing your approach might be wrong but pressing forward anyway because retreating would require admitting doubt. He'd marked the incision site on Emma's scalp with a pen during the pre-op consultation. A pediatric approach to the optic nerve pathway. Complex. Risky. The kind of procedure that required either genius or desperation, sometimes both. Mercer's hands moved across Emma's small head, the draping precisely positioned to keep his working field sterile and isolated. One of the residents reached for a retractor. Mercer snapped something at him, too quiet for Ashley to hear through the glass, but his shoulders flinched regardless. Then at 0302, exactly as Ashley had predicted when she'd pulled Emma's medication chart and run the interactions through her tactical calculator brain, the monitors began to scream. The first alarm was the oxygen saturation. 84. Then 82. The child's blood oxygen was dropping despite the anesthesia team's interventions. The second alarm was the heart rate, climbing into the dangerous zone. Mercer's hands froze over the surgical field. Not pausing. Freezing. The difference between a deliberate action and a system that had stopped responding to input. What's happening? His voice had lost its authority. It had become the voice of someone reading lines from a script he'd forgotten memorized. The anesthesiologist's response was professional calm. Pressure spike. I'm adjusting sedation levels. Push another unit of expansion. But the monitors didn't improve. Oxygen saturation dropped to 79. Heart rate climbed. Emma's small body was rejecting the medication cocktail that Mercer had calculated, the one Ashley had flagged as potentially lethal, the one he'd refused to recalculate. The exact scenario Ashley had modeled in her head during the pharmacy consultation while she pretended to be merely a concerned nurse and not a Navy medical officer trained in field triage for combat environments. Mercer reached for an instrument. Put it down. Reached for another. His hands were shaking now, visibly, the kind of tremor that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with watching your calculation become someone else's crisis. The residents exchanged a look. The kind that young doctors shared when they realized their teacher didn't have answers. 73% oxygen saturation. Critical. The monitor was a metronome counting down toward catastrophe. Ashley moved before the decision formed into conscious thought. Her body remembered the protocols more clearly than her brain could articulate them. She was through the observation room door and down the corridor that led to the surgical suite's main entrance. Her badge clipped to her collar. Her credentials fictional but her hands real, muscle memory older and deeper than any assignment from the Pentagon. Combat medic. Field surgical tech. Captain Ashley Cooper, Navy Medical Corps, who'd held a platoon sergeant's organs inside his abdomen while a Black Hawk was called down through fire to extract them both. The surgical suite doors opened under her shoulder with the force of someone who'd lived inside urgency long enough that it had become movement. Mercer looked up, his face showing something between fury and relief. The residents flinched. The anesthesiologist's hand stilled, waiting to see if this was a rescue or an intrusion. Move, Ashley said, her voice dropping 2 octaves from the careful nurse tone she'd maintained for 6 months. This was the voice of someone used to being obeyed. Not because of her title, which Mercer didn't know, but because of the absolute certainty that came with having made these kinds of calls before, when the cost of hesitation was measured in body bags. Mercer didn't move. Pride held him in place for the space of 1 breath, maybe 2. Then he saw Emma's oxygen saturation drop to 68, and he stepped back. Ashley was at the surgical field, her eyes taking in the anatomical positioning instantly, her fingers finding the landmarks through pure tactile memory. Retraction here. Visualization there. The needle decompression necessary for the spinal fluid pressure that was causing the cascade failure. Her hands moved without her supervising them, the way they always did in crisis, her voice calling out the sequence to the residents who stared at her like she'd manifested from somewhere else entirely. I need the 24-gauge needle. Midline. Just above the Fontenelle junction. Her hands were already positioning. You. Set up a portable O2 tank. Increase the desiccant. Counter the pressure effect. The residents moved. They didn't ask who she was or why she was suddenly commanding their surgical field. They moved because authority wasn't a title in crisis. Authority was knowing the next step when the person in charge had lost it. The needle went in with the slight resistance of membrane giving way. Ashley's breath was even. Her focus was absolute. The monitors began to stabilize almost immediately. Oxygen saturation climbed. 75. 78. 82. The child's body responding to the intervention exactly as it should have from the beginning if anyone had bothered to recalculate the medication interactions or consider that Mercer's approach might be fundamentally flawed. She's stabilizing, the anesthesiologist said, and there was something like awe in that voice. The kind of awe that came from watching competence materialize from nowhere and reshape a catastrophe into recovery. Emma's vitals climbed steadily. Oxygen saturation 88. Heart rate dropping from panic back to something manageable. Her small body relaxing as the pressure that had been killing her released. Ashley stepped back from the surgical field, her hand still steady, her breathing still controlled. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next when the silence in the operating room became so absolute that you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their digital complaint overhead. The room erupted in sound. Alarms screaming like wounded animals. The heart monitor's rhythm fracturing into chaos. Beep. Beep. Beep beep beep. Emma's oxygen saturation plummeted on the monitors above her small body, 94, 89, 84, the numbers dropping like a stone through dark water. Dr. Mercer stood frozen over the child's chest, his hands trembling so visibly that the surgical resident beside him shifted backward. The attending anesthesiologist called out the vital signs like a litany of failure, BP dropping, O2 sat at 78, we're losing her. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. His fingers hovered above Emma's sternum, moving slightly, purposefully nowhere. The kind of paralysis that comes from suddenly understanding your own incompetence in real time, watching it reflected in the falling numbers on every monitor in the room. The observation window was 30 feet away. Ashley had been standing there watching the routine procedure through reinforced glass when Emma's small body went rigid. Watching when everything changed. She saw Mercer's hesitation. Saw the resident's eyes widen. Saw the anesthesiologist reaching for the crash cart with hands that weren't quite steady. The surgical suite's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a mechanical swarm, bathing everything in that harsh white that makes human skin look like something already dead. Ashley didn't think. Thinking was for people with time. Her legs moved. The observation room door. The scrub station. Her hands under the water, fingers working across skin that had held too many lives in places where blood ran downhill and nobody came to help. The muscle memory was older than her nursing license, older than her decision to become a civilian, older than the scars she kept hidden under long sleeves. Her hands dried. Fresh sterile gloves snapped on like she was pulling on war paint. She entered the surgical suite at a walk, not a run. Ran meant panic. Walked meant purpose. Move. One word. Nobody questioned it. Mercer's resident peeled sideways like a gate opening. Ashley's fingers found the anatomical landmarks through pure instinct, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her touch reading the child's small ribs like braille text. The angiocath needle was in her other hand already, 14 gauge, its plastic hub bright green. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply moved the way someone moves when they've done this before in places where hesitation means body bags. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That specific sound, the pressure equalizing, the tension leaving, it was a sound she'd heard in combat tents and field hospitals and once in the back of a Black Hawk at 3,000 feet with a sergeant's chest cavity collapsing. The numbers on the monitor paused. Hung suspended like held breath. Then began climbing. 84, 87. 91, 95. Oxygen saturation creeping back to normal like a tide coming in. Get me a 24 gauge for a second line, Ashley said, her voice dropping into that clipped cadence that made residents move faster than conscious thought could manage. Warm crystalloid, wide open. I need current pressures and last lab values. The attending anesthesiologist was already reading them back before she finished the sentence, muscle memory and institutional authority working in synchrony. This was the language she'd spoken before she knew how to be a nurse. Before she learned to apologize. Before she learned to make herself small. Mercer's hands had stopped shaking. They were moving now, steadying. She stepped back, giving him the space to take over the stabilization protocols, because that's what you did, you bought time and then you got out of the way and let the person who needed redemption find it or not find it. 90 seconds. That's all Emma Davidson had needed. 90 seconds of someone who'd done this in triage tents and collapsed villages and the dark spaces where medicine becomes pure survival. By 0:30, Emma's small chest was rising and falling with steady rhythm. In and out. The way all small chests should. Her oxygen saturation holding at 98%, her blood pressure stabilizing, the crisis moment already beginning to calcify into history. The kind of history that gets written differently depending on whose name goes on the report. Ashley stood at the scrub sink watching blood swirl down the drain. Red spiraling into nothing. Her hands had stopped trembling about the time Emma's saturation hit 96, her body finally registering that the immediate threat had passed. She watched the red disappear, watched her hands go pale and clinical under the water, and she was thinking about something her squad leader had said once in the Hindu Kush while the mountains kept their counsel: the moment you're not needed is the moment everything changes. Mercer's reflection appeared in the mirror behind her before she heard his footsteps. "Get out," he said quietly. The controlled rage beneath those two words was like pressure building behind a dam. Ashley didn't turn around. She finished scrubbing under her fingernails where blood had found its way in, the small ritualistic motions that kept you tethered to yourself. She dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser with deliberate slowness. Then she turned to face him. His jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth were likely aching. His eyes had gone that particular shade of fury that comes from a man who'd just watched himself fail in front of 15 witnesses and one woman he'd already decided didn't belong. "You violated your reassignment restrictions," he said, his voice like gravel settling. "You entered a surgical suite without authorization. You contaminated a sterile field. You administered intervention without physician direction." Ashley said nothing. Silence was one of her older skills. "Your employment is terminated. Effective immediately. Security is being called to escort you from the building. You may collect personal items only. Nothing from this hospital leaves with you." He didn't ask her to respond. He didn't wait for her to explain. He simply turned and walked back toward recovery where Emma Davidson was breathing steadily in a bed that would hold her safely through the morning. Within 2 hours, Mercer had made his calls. The overnight surgical team was reassigned to evening shifts and opposite wings of the hospital, distributed like contamination control. The surgical logs were altered, timestamps adjusted, notations rewritten, Emma's crisis recorded as a minor complication that Mercer himself had managed with textbook precision. Ashley's intervention was reduced to a line about unauthorized presence during critical event, does not require formal documentation. The residents who'd watched her perform that needle decompression found themselves assigned to Mercer's service, where their futures suddenly depended on forgetting what they'd seen. Her building access was restricted through formal hospital policy. A memo went out to all departments: Captain Ashley Cooper was barred from Cedar Creek Medical pending an internal investigation into gross negligence. Mercer told the resident she'd administered unauthorized medications and violated protocol. He used the word reckless. He used the word dangerous. He positioned her intervention as the kind of cowboy medicine that got children killed, not saved. Security escorted her to the employee break room at 0700 while the morning shift was arriving, making sure everyone saw. They gave her 15 minutes to collect her things while a guard in a blue uniform stood in the doorway looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Ashley packed in silence. The cracked world's okayest nurse mug that someone had given her on her first day at Cedar Creek, a nurse she'd never see again. The dying succulent on the windowsill that she'd watered every Tuesday without fail. A photo in a frame that showed 5 people in army combat uniform, standing in the mountain dust with the Hindu Kush climbing into the background. 3 of the faces had been carefully marked through with red pen, the names of the dead, the acknowledgement of what that dust had claimed. And the jacket! The one she'd brought from her old life and kept in her locker with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, that small piece of embroidered identity that nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew how to read. She placed these things in a cardboard box that the guard handed her, watching her the way people watch someone doing the thing they always secretly feared someone might do, fail publicly, stand there in the fluorescent light while the world moved past them, carrying the weight of invisible things. The bus stop was 2 blocks away, half hidden behind a parking structure where the rain was hammering down like applause for an audience that wasn't watching. Ashley stood there with the cardboard box on her hip, her scrubs soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull. Early commuters hurried past without looking at her too directly, the way people do when they sense something fractured nearby, some breaking that might be contagious if you stared at it too long. Her phone buzzed. Pentagon number. She didn't answer it. Her mission had been clear from the start: embed as a civilian nurse, observe Captain Marcus Davidson's daughter, monitor the treatment protocols Mercer was using on Emma's optic nerve damage, gather intelligence on whether the nerve damage was actually from the IED blast or from something else entirely, something experimental that Mercer had been developing in those closed-door consultations. The data she'd been covertly collecting on Emma's medical history, the drug interaction she'd documented, the irregularities in Mercer's procedures, all of it belonged to the Pentagon now. Belonged to whatever black-budget program had sent her into Cedar Creek Medical as a cover story and a sacrifice. Blowing her cover meant losing access. Losing access meant losing the only chance to get the full picture of what Mercer had been doing to that child. The bus arrived, hydraulics hissing, and Ashley boarded it. She paid her fare with cash and sat in the middle where nobody would bother her, the cardboard box on her lap like a coffin for the life she'd borrowed here. Through the window she watched Cedar Creek Medical disappear behind the rain, believing that Emma would wake up to her father's voice, believing that the child would be safe now, believing that her sacrifice would matter. What she didn't know was that Mercer had already called the medical board. That he'd filed a formal complaint against her nursing license. That he'd scheduled a press conference for Thursday morning to warn other hospitals about the dangerous nurse who'd nearly killed a patient through reckless intervention and unauthorized medication administration. What she didn't know was that 3 days later, everything was about to change again. That evening, Ashley stands at a rain-soaked bus stop with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. The box weighs almost nothing, which somehow makes it heavier. Inside, a cracked mug that reads "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a dying succulent with brown-tipped leaves, and a photograph printed on standard paper, the kind you can get at any drugstore for $3. The photo shows her old unit. 12 faces arranged in 3 rows, desert behind them, 2009. 3 of those faces have been crossed out in KIA red marker, the lines violent and permanent. She doesn't look at the photo. She can't. Not here. Not in public. The rain hammers the sidewalk like applause for a performance nobody asked for, and Ashley watches a cab's headlights approach through the downpour, distorted and hazy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that her mission had failed. Emma's sight depended on data Ashley was supposed to collect, analyze, deliver to the Pentagon's Medical Research Division. Instead, she'd blown her cover to save a child's life, and in doing so, had compromised the classified research that might have saved dozens more. That was the calculus that kept her standing in the rain, the cold mathematics of sacrifice. 1 life saved. Dozens potentially lost. The hospital's secure wing occupied the basement of Cedar Creek Medical, where they kept the transfers nobody wanted advertised, violent offenders with medical conditions, prisoners requiring treatment, people the public never saw. That's where the call came through at 0847 the next morning. A prisoner transfer. Zahir Ahmadi, former Taliban commander, shrapnel wound to his left shoulder, listed as a security risk and to be escorted at all times. Ashley was 3 blocks away when the notification hit the hospital's secure network, still packed in her apartment with the boxes stacked against the wall like a life in pause. But the Pentagon liaison had been clear: stay close. Stay accessible. Emma's case isn't closed. By the time Ashley arrived at Cedar Creek's basement corridor, using a security clearance that technically shouldn't exist for a nurse who'd been fired, the transfer had already begun. Zahir Ahmadi walked between 2 armed federal marshals, his left arm bandaged, his eyes moving with the calculation of a man who'd survived wars and interrogations. He was tall. He moved like someone who understood the weight of violence, the economy of it, the way a single decision could reshape continents. His eyes caught Ashley's as she passed the holding area, and in that moment, less than a second, the kind of exchange that the unobservant miss entirely, recognition flashed across his face. Zahir locked eyes with her. His lips moved, barely audible, a single phrase in Pashto that landed like a shaped charge, Shaitan Doctor. The Devil Doctor. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 15 degrees. A Marine guard standing 3 feet away went rigid. Not the kind of rigid that comes from surprise. The kind that comes from understanding exactly what he'd just heard, and exactly what it meant. His name was Torres, and his mother had taught him Pashto before she died, and he'd spoken it with her for 23 years, and he recognized the voice of someone who'd survived long enough to have enemies with names. Torres turned. His eyes found Ashley's face. And he did what protocol demanded. He walked directly to the records room and pulled the file marked Cooper, Ashley. What he read out loud, his voice steady as a heartbeat, made the room go silent. Captain Ashley Cooper, Navy Medical Corps, Silver Star for Valor, Purple Heart. A pause. His eyes moved down the page. Second Purple Heart. Classified deployment record. Active clearance. Operational status, undercover at Cedar Creek Medical. He looked up. His voice dropped. Why is a Navy captain working as a civilian nurse? That's when Dr. Mercer burst through the records room door like something was chasing him. His face had the texture of spoiled meat, his eyes wide and darting, and his voice emerged in a ragged demand, "Remove her. Security. Now. That woman is a liability to this hospital and a danger to patient care. I want her off the premises in 5 minutes." But before the security guards could move, before anyone could respond, the door opened again. A full-bird colonel stepped through in dress white so precisely pressed they could cut skin. The insignia on his uniform was immaculate. His presence had the texture of compressed authority, a man who'd spent 40 years in uniform and carried that weight like oxygen. He assessed the room in one sweeping glance, Dr. Mercer's panic, Torres's rigid attention, Ashley's absolute stillness, and he rendered a crisp salute to the decorations Ashley hadn't worn in 18 months. Not the casual acknowledgement some officers gave to enlisted personnel. The full salute. The kind reserved for those who'd earned it through blood and choice. "Captain Cooper," the colonel said, his voice carrying the precision of military command. "The Pentagon sends its regards." Dr. Mercer's face cycled through several colors, red, then white, then a mottled purple that suggested his nervous system was malfunctioning. "I don't understand," he started, but the colonel had already turned away from him, already dismissed him with the casual cruelty of military hierarchy. Mercer was a civilian. In this room, Mercer had become invisible. Before the colonel could speak further, before he could announce whatever classified call sign or operational designation Ashley held, the records room door opened a third time. Carlos Mendez walked in carrying a hard drive the size of a playing card. He was the hospital's IT specialist, a veteran himself, 14 years with 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, the Dark Horse, before a roadside IED took his left leg and gave him a pension and a reason to understand what people like Ashley were doing here in the fluorescent corridors of civilian medicine. He plugged the drive into the wall monitor without preamble. The footage began playing in high definition. Timestamps in the corner. 0530 hours. The surgical room after Emma's emergency. Dr. Mercer standing alone, handshaking, looking at the monitors where a child's vital signs climbed back toward survival because of intervention he didn't perform. Then his hands moving. Reaching for the keyboard. Deleting files. The system asking if he was certain. Him confirming. Files vanishing like evidence of failure. Then a second camera angle. The medication logs. Dr. Mercer's handwriting changing dosages, making it appear that he'd ordered the emergency interventions that Ashley had performed. Altering records with the methodical precision of someone who'd practiced lying before. "No," Dr. Mercer said. "No. That's routine data management. I was cleaning." At 0530, the colonel said quietly, "Exactly 90 minutes after a pediatric patient crashed during your procedure, you deleted the surgical recordings. Explain." The words came out of Mercer like mud. "Clerical errors. I was correcting." Carlos played another clip. The emergency medication logs. Ashley's actual interventions. Mercer's subsequent alterations. The timestamps in sequence like a confession written in real time. You reassigned all 3 nurses who witnessed the emergency, the colonel continued, his voice never rising, which somehow made it more devastating. You restricted Captain Cooper's access to the pediatric ward. You filed a formal complaint against her nursing license. And you deleted evidence of what actually occurred in that surgical suite. He turned to Dr. Mercer fully. You froze during a pediatric emergency, Dr. Mercer. A captain in the United States Navy saved that child's life while you stood paralyzed. And your response was to cover that up. The door opened again. Captain Marcus Davidson entered, his service dog guiding him with the harness held in his left hand. His other hand was empty at his side. He was blind. The optic nerve damage from a Taliban nerve agent exposure in Kandahar 4 years ago had taken his sight permanently, but he moved through the room like he could see every conscience in it. A father moves with particular authority. A warrior who's lost something moves with particular gravity. A father and a warrior combined is a force that bends reality around him. He faced Dr. Mercer directly, his service dog settling at his side with the discipline of trained precision. Did you freeze? Captain Davidson's voice was steady, but underneath it ran a current of something that made everyone in the room go very still. Did you freeze while my daughter stopped breathing? Dr. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The lies started tumbling out like water finding cracks. It was the resident's fault. The equipment was faulty. The hospital protocols were unclear. The nurses didn't communicate properly. Everyone but himself. Everyone but the man who'd held a scalpel over an 8-year-old's chest and found himself unable to move. Captain Cooper was undercover in your hospital, the Pentagon liaison said, and her voice had the weight of official machinery, of classified operations, of decisions made in rooms without windows. Her mission was to monitor your treatment of Captain Davidson's daughter while analyzing the neurological connection between his nerve agent exposure in Kandahar and her optic nerve damage. She maintained her cover under your abuse, under your public humiliation, your reassignment, your threats, because Emma's life depended on the data she was collecting. You didn't just attack a nurse, Dr. Mercer. You sabotaged a classified military medical operation. The hospital board chair's voice came next, quiet and final. Your privileges at Cedar Creek Medical are permanently revoked, effective immediately. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation. We're forwarding this evidence to the State Medical Board with our recommendation for permanent revocation. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Mercer at Norfolk Community College, teaching CPR fundamentals to students who'd never heard of his name, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy for $18 an hour. His hands, once confident on a scalpel, were now pressing down on rubber and air. His colleagues didn't return his calls. The teaching hospitals wouldn't touch him. His reputation had crystallized into cautionary tale. Across town in Patterson Park, Ashley Cooper walked hand in hand with Emma Davidson through autumn leaves that had turned the color of rust and copper. Emma's vision had been restored. The Pentagon's research division had analyzed the data Ashley collected, finding the connection between Marcus Davidson's exposure to VX nerve agent and his daughter's rare autoimmune optic neuropathy. The treatment they developed, a targeted immunosuppressant protocol combined with regenerative cellular therapy, had given Emma back the world in color and light and definition. 3 other military families had used it now. 3 other children could see because Ashley had stayed long enough to gather the data, long enough to watch and wait and document. Emma wore her father's old jacket, the kind military families never discard. The faded unit patch was sewn inside the lining, barely visible now. Ashley helped the girl fold back the collar, and Emma's small fingers traced the insignia, the same patch that Ashley had worn into the Hindu Kush Mountains 8 years ago, before everything changed, before the choices and sacrifices had calcified into something that looked like strength. Captain Marcus Davidson joined them, his service dog beside him, his presence like a cornerstone. He faced Ashley with the precision of a man who'd relearned the world through sound and memory and the voice of his daughter. "She tells me you gave her back the colors," he said, his voice thick with something that moved between gratitude and grief and the particular knowledge that comes from surviving what you thought would destroy you. My daughter describes sunsets now. She tells me about the sky. Ashley watched Emma chase a butterfly that drifted through the autumn light, the girl's laughter bright and clear and unbroken. The cardboard box in the rain seemed impossibly far away now. The dying succulent. The cracked mug. The photograph with the 3 crossed-out faces. Those things had belonged to a different version of Ashley, the one who'd believed sacrifice meant staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. The Pentagon had offered her a position training combat medics, building better emergency medical training for special operations units. She'd requested something different instead. Assignment back to pediatric care. Back to the work that matters, the quiet work, the work nobody photographs or medals or remembers until a child looks up at you and says she can see the stars now, and you realize that some kinds of heroism don't need uniforms or recognition. Emma called out that she'd found a red leaf, the exact color of courage, and pressed it into Ashley's palm like a medal that meant more than metal ever could. If you've made it this far, you already know the truth. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Subscribe for more stories about the people who change the world in the spaces nobody's watching. Like this video if you believe that real heroism lives in quiet choices. And comment below, if you were Ashley, would you have kept your cover or blown it to save Emma?